Listen, right now, we're at this time where things are going to be in our favor this month. You're going to see a lot of things in our favor this month that are going to give you great hope. But that will quickly dwindle in December purposely. It is a Christian holiday and they must crush you. I'm telling you that now. They will amplify to minimize the impact of your wins. This war began a long time ago. This is the tail end of it, and the whole world is watching. Your wins begin in February. SCOTUS Gate should have happened February last year. And the inclinations were there. The things that were happening had started. It already initiated, but then it changed. Why? Because even key players like you, the people, were not making the moves needed. It's kind of like a domino thing. If one domino's out of place, it's not going to drop the other ones right after it. Everybody needs to be in place for it to go. So then there's a delay. Let's put those dominoes back up and knock it down. I want you to remember what happens in November will be transported into February and start to bloom. And you're going to see a change in your nation that you have never envisioned. You have because you've hoped. The awakening isn't something you can stop. It's not something you control. It's not something that you can command. And it's letting the truth out. And it's a lion on its own. It doesn't need help. It doesn't need defending. It stands on its own. The only reason you see there's a war now is because you woke up. But it's going to be so different. And at the time that it happens, it won't be shocking to you because you'll be the one actually having it done. So it's all beginning now. This month is going to be kind of incredible. We're going to be busy. It doesn't even feel like Christmas is coming. But I can tell you something. This year has gone away with warp speed, huh? You've blinked, and it's 2022 already. It's almost as if it went real quick to make the pain go easy. February, when we'll start seeing things happening the way they should.